Right, great. I think I have a sort of stable screen full of people at the moment, and that everybody who wanted to join at 6 is with us. So we'll make a start. Welcome to this, which is the first Parkes Institute seminar of 2024. So we'll begin by wishing everybody a happy new year. I don't recognize everybody on the screen, so I'll begin by assuming that you don't recognize me. My name is Neil Gregor. I am Professor of Modern European History at the University of Southampton, and I am also the Director of the Parkes Institute, and it's my great privilege to chair tonight's seminar come workshop, which is designed really as a very informal event, just to give two of our wonderful PhD students an opportunity to talk a little bit about their work and gain some feedback and some comment in a sort of friendly, informal environment. Now, on the face of it, the two topics are very different, and there's a level on which that is true, but they also speak to a shared overarching theme, which I suppose one might sort of summarize as the sort of the emotional landscapes of modern European Jewish experience and life, albeit in two very different spaces and with two very different methodologies. So we thought what it might be productive and interesting to do would be to get them to speak separately and to take questions on their papers separately in the first instance. And then we will keep 20 minutes back at the end to see if we can bring the two papers into conversation with one another and see whether there are some shared themes which emerge that speak to something bigger. So let me, without further ado, introduce our first speaker, which is Sarah Prais. Sarah is working on a PhD on working class Jewish women in Minsk in the late 19th century, with a sort of strongly literary approach, if I can put it that way. And she's kindly agreed to talk to us on the subject, A Marriage of Unequals, ? A historical discussion of romance and marriage in Jewish Minsk in the late Russian Empire. So I'll hand over to you, Sarah, to share your screen. If I can ask everyone else to be sure.
Hello, everyone.
That they're muted, and we'll convene for questions afterwards. Thank you, Sarah. All yours.
So is that full screen as well?
That's right.
Great. Okay. So thank you very much. And that's the title. I've got what I'm presenting here is just one chapter. So I'll explain to you my general aim in the whole project, in the whole PhD, is to reach a better understanding of the daily life in Minsk, in the Northwestern Pale, in particular, of this group that has been neglected in research, of the working class Jewish women at this time, from around the mid 19th century till the first revolution. I chose I have a few different aims that came together. One is the focus on Minsk, which my supervisor, Professor Foll, she's written on Minsk, the Jewish Minsk in the modern time, but in general, research is generally focused on historical research is focused on modern Jewish life in the bigger towns, in Moscow, also in the Ukraine. And if in the Paleolithic settlement in the southern part, I wanted to focus on Minsk, that didn't have a university, but had a huge working class. And as I will argue, I think as well as the vibrant political life, made a huge cultural contribution. And the working class women are at the center of this. This is part of my argument. Sorry, just see how I can move forward to the next slide. Sorry. 1 moment. Google slide, next slide. Yes. Can you see the next slide now?
We can see it. There's a slight
Yeah,
box at the
okay.
top covering the top. Oh, it's moved away now, so it should be okay. Because it says
Oh,
speaker.
so sorry, wait, I'll just click back again. Okay. One moment, sorry. Go back again. One moment, sorry. I'm not so experienced in Google Slides. I'll just share again and be more careful. Share again. Try and get back to the beginning. A moment. Sorry about this. Here we are. Yeah, sorry, it's because once I'm on full screen, I lose a bit control, but if I click carefully, it should be okay. Right, so share again. Okay, you can't see it at the moment, is that right?
No, we can't
Now.
see it just yet.
Now.
It's loading.
And
yeah, we can see it now. If
and
you
now I
full
have
screen
to,
it, then
it's not full screen, right?
not yet.
Okay, full screen again. Okay. Okay, so
Perfect.
the subject of love and marriage is, I decided to do thematic analysis. Also, as you mentioned, I'm coming at it through the literary lens, through the writing, the published fiction of working class women in Yiddish in Minsk at this time. This is, in general, Yiddish prose in the modern era has been neglected in favor of poetry. Recently, in the last few decades, there have been more translations into English as we have fewer Yiddish readers. There have been more translations, more reviews, but often these have also focused on middle-class women. And it was important to me to focus on these writings. And once I started looking at it, they were serialized, generally serialized in the Yiddish newspapers. I realized that this is a huge area. I argue that it's a genre in itself. The writings of these working class women in Yiddish, it's quality. It's different from the Shun, the very popular literature, and at the same time, I'm looking also at the styles, how they were influenced by Russian and European literature, and also the themes that they covered and how it overlaps with their social and political activism. Their writings as giving a voice to the protest that they couldn't express in other areas. As women, often traditionally religious women, in Minsk was still religiously traditional. They didn't have a place in the community, but they did have the sympathetic support of the editors of the Yiddish newspapers, and they had many thousands of readers, men and women, and not just simple workers, but literary families as well. And this was a space in which they could express their complaints, their conflicts, their emotions. And love and marriage is one of the themes. I looked at it thematically, so the themes of poverty, the themes of education, how they were often educated in unconventional ways, but much more educated than we would think, even if they didn't have the means to attend school. And this is one of the chapters. And why I felt it was an important aspect is because, firstly, in this time of social dislocation, when industrialization meant that suddenly the end of the feudal system, and also industrialization, meant that Jews were no longer working on the farms. The men who were artisans, what they were producing could be mass produced much more cheaply in the factories. Women who would previously have been in the home had to work. And what one would think, and they hoped, that the home, the marriage, was a place of security in a time where everything else was changing. And also within, from the literary perspective, people liked to read, readers enjoyed reading about romances. They enjoyed the escapism of reading sentimental stories, perhaps about princes and princesses in exotic locations, but even not if they were reading the more sensationalist literature, but they were interested in general about marriage, love, marriage, romance is always a popular topic. Also, this came at, as I said before, this came at a time when the Yiddish Press was, the ascent of the Yiddish Press. Yiddish Press was growing. Greater attention was being paid in the Russian Jewish press to Yiddish literature. The level was going up, and of course, more and more people could read Yiddish and wanted to read Yiddish. It was also the language of thousands of political pamphlets that were being distributed, especially in places like Minsk, which was a center of the Bund Jewish labor movement and of many other movements as well. Okay. Right. So originally, when I started this research, I was researching Roche Brokhes. She's a writer who's been translated more and researched more recently. But as I looked into her writings, I discovered that there are other women, contemporaries, similar to her, and they all had similar childhoods. They definitely knew each other. It's taken quite a while to build the connections. Brokhes was friends with Avram Reisen, who was an editor, publicist, and his brother wrote the Lexicon of Yiddish Literature, Zalman Reisen. But they also had sisters, and their younger sister, Sarah Reisen, is a forgotten writer in the same way that Brokhes was. Brokhes at the time, I discovered recently that she was also, because towards the end of the 19th century, of course, especially in the Northwestern Pale, there was mass emigration. And she was writing for newspapers that were read in America, Yiddish newspapers like the Forwards, as well as she was published simultaneously in Russia and in America. And I saw recently in the Californian newspaper, a Jewish newspaper, Emmanuel, that is still published today. They said that they did a survey in 1907 amongst all their readers. Who is in your view the best female Yiddish writer today? And they overwhelmingly voted for her. So she was popular across the ocean, but there's also a universality to her writing, and it's also crossed time. People read her stories today, even without knowing the context that she was writing in. Her writing is shocking, sensitive, draws you in, and you don't have to understand the difficulties that she faced and the whole circumstances that of working from childhood and the desperate poverty. Even without knowing all this, her stories have a strong impact. So she herself lost her mother at 9 and started to work as a seamstress from home. She didn't emigrate. She continued writing. She stopped briefly when she was married. In 1942, there was going to be a state edition of all her short stories, but the Holocaust came first, and she died in the Minsk ghetto, the ghetto for local people. There were also many people brought there from the West, and her writings were forgotten until about 10 years ago. Okay, so there is correspondence in the YIVO archive between her and Sarah Reisen. The men and the women activist writers, they helped each other to get published. They shared their connections. There are letters about sending from Minsk to America. And Sarah Reisen was orphaned. She lost her mother at 15. She was also a seamstress and later a tutor of Russian. She writes in the symbolist style, in a very different style from Brokhes. Sarah Reisen knew, there's correspondence between Sarah Reisen and Roche Feigenberg. Roche Feigenberg, who had lost both parents by 15. Initially, she was the daughter of a rabbi. So Brokhes and Reisen continued writing in Yiddish their whole lives. Feigenberg and Baum emigrated to Israel in their 30s, and they moved to writing in Hebrew. So Feigenberg was orphaned. She lost first her father. She worked in a shop. She's wrote autobiographical writings about that, about her experiences. And by the time she was 15, she'd lost both parents. As I said, she emigrated to Israel. She married an editor who was 25 years older than her. She was widowed, and she remained a writer her whole life. Devorah Baron wrote in Yiddish. She later wanted to discard her Yiddish writings. Fortunately for us, they were already published, and they've recently been rediscovered in the last 5 years even. She wrote Hebrew versions of the Yiddish stories, and she's known as one of the first Hebrew female writer to write in Hebrew, but I'm interested for these purposes in her Yiddish writings. And oh, sorry, I just have to plug in my computer. Sorry about this before it runs down. Sorry. I'm going to save this. Yes. Okay. And they all lived in Minsk, or in the area of Minsk. Sarah Reisen lived in Uzda, and they had brothers who knew each other. And Brokhes held a kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say it was a salon, but her home, or her mother's home, was an open meeting place for activists and writers, and she had many admirers, and she was a strong, courageous personality. Writing already, they all started writing very young. But she in particular is unafraid to approach any theme and to express extreme anger, which boils into a kind of rage and madness, to expressing her critique. I mean, in this chapter, we focus specifically on her critique of men in marriage, men who were happy to leave behind arranged marriages, but didn't envisage any kind of equality in their marriage. They were looking more at the bourgeois model of the woman in the home, the woman in the sphere with the children, and they with their social circles and their activism. So Jewish Minsk in 1900, to give you a picture, and down here is a street. I think it's 1897, the photo that I got. So you can see a very large community, more than half Jewish, a huge workforce of young Jewish women in factories and also in small tailoring workshops, sometimes run by men, sometimes there was a woman in charge. producing piecework for Jewish middlemen, who then sold it to the larger factories. It took it to the Ukraine. Center of the Bund, especially at the beginning, from founding meetings, other political movements, the opposition, the Zionist movements. And as I said before, neglected in historical research. And this research is hoping to correct that to some extent. Okay, so existing research on Jewish marriage in the Russian Empire at this time, around 1900. So we have the rejection of arranged marriages, working in factories, meeting as activists, meeting in the Bund and the Jewish Workers' Party. Suddenly we have spaces where men and Jewish women can mix freely. Also, young women working, contributing to the income of their parents, experiencing a greater influence, more confidence, to say I want to choose. So they wanted to choose who they married, as opposed to in the past where the parents would choose a suitable match, agreeing with the parents, another set of parents looking for social status, looking for maybe a man who is learned. Rise in the marital age. In the middle classes, this was mainly because young people wanted to study first. In the working classes, and we have to also remember that Minsk, I didn't mention, Minsk is becoming more and more crowded in this time. The mortality rate is going down. There's better health. Also, we have the restrictions of the Tsar on where Jewish people can live, and also crowding around the limited work. So they're moving in from the urban areas, people living in small apartments. It's much more difficult to find somewhere to live. The Lithuanian tradition where the parents or parents-in-law, that the young couple lives with the parents or parents-in-law for the first few years until they can stand on their own feet financially. That was not possible in these small apartments. Okay, these are contributory factors to the rise in marital age among the poor and the working class. And working class women having a bigger voice within the marriage because they were working or wanting to have a bigger voice. I mean, we see this in the statistics. The divorce, Shaul Stampfer has made a significant research on this, arguing that the divorce was quite common. And I saw also among the women writers in their own biographies. So Sarah Reisen divorced. Women were able to divorce and to support themselves. They also, Reisen, Baron, and Feigenberg emigrated. They were not married. They moved to America or Israel as single women, supporting themselves until they married, which was unthinkable in previous generations. Also supporting Sarah Reisen and Devorah Baron supported themselves during their studies. They were orphaned, but they tutored, boarded with families, and supported themselves during their university studies. Okay, but of course, within the marriage, this is a cause of tension. The maskilim of the Jewish Enlightenment, they said no more arranged marriages, but they also said in their autobiographies, they often said that we suffered from the dominant mother, the dominant wife. We want women can have more education, but their place is in the home and with the children. And the man is out in the wider world, in the wider business, social world, and working. in the socio-economic reality of the working class in Minsk at this time, this was not possible. For financial reasons, women couldn't stay at home, so they were working. They were mixing socially, and they had demands as well within the marriage, the respect that they expected, and the attention and the relationship that they wanted with their husbands. So looking at the background of the classical Yiddish writers at this time, the focus on the male experience of marriage, the complaints about the nagging, dominating wives, the fathers losing the power that they had as the matchmakers of their daughters. This is the classic. This is the focus of the main theme of the story of Tevye the milkman, where with daughter after daughter, he would like to suggest a suitable match, and there's no question. They have their own ideas. Peretz, more sympathetic to women, stories with women protagonists, the anger of women suffering in their marriages from lack of attention, dissatisfaction with where they're living, dissatisfaction with how their husbands are behaving. He was more open to this. A moment. Okay, so at the time that these these women, the women I discussed, are publishing, there's great interest in public culture. Of course, Anna Karenina, which was Sarah Reisen translated into Yiddish and serialized, also read in Russian by other in the Jewish world. And the beginning of popular culture in general, but also dominated by Jewish figures in the area of Minsk. Arkady Arkatov, who made many films, not all of Jewish interest, 3 with Jewish characters, but others for the general Gentile audience. You can see a still at the bottom from his film L'Chaim, which is about a woman who she meets a penniless student who she wants to marry, but her parents pressure her to marry a wealthy man who she has little in common with, and she marries him. But after 2 years, she leaves him and takes their child to be with the poor man that she wanted to marry before. I won't give away the tragic ending. And the Shund literature, the popular Yiddish literature, dominated by Shaikevich, known as Shomer, a big threat to the classical writers in terms of circulation, published in the newspapers, but also published in pamphlets that people bought. Shalom Aleichem published a pamphlet called Shomer's Mishpat, where he says that this writing is bringing standards down, it's plagiarized, it's poorly constructed, it's encouraging people to read this lower level of literature when they should be reading the classics that he was publishing. But again, romance is a major theme for them in this literature. Okay, and now I want to talk about the themes that these women wrote on. And one of the major themes was the conflict between activism and romance. You can see can you see in the picture below, young members of the Bund around 1900, no separation, women at the front and at the back, a place where they could mix freely, a place where they were leaders, a place where they experienced equality in the fight for better conditions at work. This is a theme of one of Brokhes's most most popular and successful stories, called Unter Berg, where there's Hannah, the female protagonist, is married to a factory supervisor, Yasha, who is also an agitator. He's very popular. Everyone wants to listen to his speeches. He's always out of the house. When he's at home, he doesn't speak to her. He's reading pamphlets. They feel disconnected. She's at home with the child. She's desperately trying to find a place in his life. She comes very much second place to his activism. Eventually, she goes mad. She starts seeing visions of demons. And here we have a quote from the story. Mein Gebet seht wie wilder Eigenliebe, wie nicht Entwickeltkeit. Schämt sich, sagt mit mir. Hat keine Zusammenbindung mit mir nicht. She's traditionally religious. He dismisses it. He is modern and secular, and he says that she's just muttering to herself. He's ashamed of her in the face of the workers that are below him and his fellow activists. Eventually, she sees him as a grotesque demon and stabs him. Okay, we have this melodramatic ending to many of her stories, but there's a gradual build-up, as you see that on the one hand, her husband, Yasha, has this awareness. He's tuned in to the workers, to what they want, but he's not tuned into the needs of his wife. He's fighting, he's harnessing the anger of the other workers, but he doesn't know where to begin with the rage of his wife, and completely unable to build an emotional connection with her. I think I showed in, I don't want to try and go back, but I showed in the previous slide was also a story by Sarah Reisen in her symbolist style. She coming, as you said, she portrays a story of a series of interwoven dreams, of love, of a princess in a tower, of unattainable love. And in the end, you see that the dreams belong to an activist who is an elite member of the Bund. He's about to be executed for being a traitor to the Tsar and to the empire. And a bird is speaking to him and mocking him and saying, what have you done with your life? You have no one. You didn't fall in love. You didn't marry. And he says, my love was for the workers, for the world, and for the other. Gives himself completely to his cause, which is another issue another issue within the activism, amongst the activists, the pure doctrine of not marrying, or if you do marrying another activist, because the cause always has to come first. Another theme, especially with Feigenberg, is the criticism of husbands who are open to romance, but in her Zwei Welten, she describes a student who is living out of marriage, but when the protagonist, when Dina becomes pregnant, he can't understand her shame. He also feels it seems to be completely disconnected. He's continuing with his studies and his life, the child and the reaction of her parents, and how they're going to build a family is of no interest to him. He doesn't take that responsibility. He was interested in the free love, but not in the responsibility for his child. And Brokhes also has several stories about men who say that they have a business, they're successful, they're going to play an equal part at home, but the promises that they make at the time of the match or at the time of the meeting, they don't live up to them, and the wife is working and running the household, and the husband is taking no responsibility and expecting to be supported. Here we have the quote from Dina.
Sarah,
yes, I'm running out of time.
Briefly interrupt. Your 20 minutes are somewhat up, so if you could start.
Yes, I can just move to the conclusion. Yes, okay. So I skipped over the quote there. And the other theme that I don't really have time to speak about now is about migration. In one moment, I'll just move out of the full screen. I can see you. Men in interior migration within Russia, the woman left alone at home, the man not understanding her loneliness, her jealousy. This was a popular theme for these women that wrote about the woman's experience, not the man's experience, which was written about so much in Yiddish literature, where he travels and how difficult it is to adapt to a different culture, but the woman waiting at home for letters, waiting sometimes for years, bringing up the children on her own. So sorry, maybe I can just share the conclusion. A moment. Just here we are. Conclusion. Yes. A moment. Can you see it? Can you see it now, the conclusion?
I think, yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. So romance and marriage is something that women hope will be a place of comfort in the time of so many other changes and suffering in other areas, something they want to read about, something they want to experience. Reading also social protests, protagonists disappointed in different ways, the neglect, the selfishness of their husbands, the inconsistence that on the one hand they're very equal in the workers' movement, but at home the story is very different, and also this as a major theme, a very popular theme, and symbiotic influence. I didn't mention that before, but a number of scholars say that the modernism and romance allowed women to write on these topics, but writing on these topics also affected the expectations of men and women. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks ever so much for an incredibly sort of wide-ranging overview with a few sort of tasters of the textual textures towards the end, which really gave that a sort of gives a feel for what the meat of the thesis is about. So we have maybe sort of 5-10 minutes just to see if we have any questions for Sarah specifically on her paper. Do please raise your hands, or possibly write into the chat if that's easiest. Well, let me, Sarah, while others are sort of gathering their thoughts, just ask I suppose a basic methodological question, really, or a question about what it is that you think your approach is going to show. You've focused in on Minsk, and I suppose my question would be: are you doing so because you want to illustrate something that you think is broader about Eastern Central Europe, or because you think that there's something sort of particular about the culture of Minsk that will make it stand out from I don't know, Lviv or Odessa or any other city that you'd care to mention in that region? Is there something particular about Jewish working class women's experience in Minsk that takes you in the direction of arguing that there's something different going on here, or am I just looking at a case study that illuminates something wider?
So I think that the experience is particularly intense. Obviously, in Minsk, obviously we have like the problems of poverty and industrialization throughout the Pale, especially in the northwestern Pale. But this particular mix of the activism, I think that within the Yiddish newspapers, that there's actually a Minsk network that hasn't been researched, that travels to America, that's something particular about the intellectual scene in Minsk, which wasn't studied before, because the focus has been more on the classical writing, the male writers and the universities. And so I don't think I think that there is something unique about the scene at that time, but obviously elements of it are common factors in the experience of the Jewish populace, the non-middle, not the middle class, the working and the poor, across the Pale at this time. So I think it has both. I think there are unique factors, and also it informs us about the masses, how the experience and conflicts of the majority of the Jewish population across the Pale in this time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Sonia Golantz, you've got a hand up, I think.
Yes, thank you. I was really pleased to hear about this topic, and especially to see a photograph of Brokhes. I've taught her a number of times, and I wasn't aware of the photograph, so I'm curious if you could tell us about that. But my main question was that I was curious to what extent this chapter deals with feminist scholarship in particular, dealing with these authors. And I'm thinking in particular about the extent to which it's in conversation with work by Naomi Seidman and Alison Schachter.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, if we could hear a bit more about that, that would be really great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, I have especially Naomi Seidman's work about this. The interaction of Naomi Seidman argues very strongly that the literature, the literature and literature written by women on the subject of romance influences the expectations, as well as the other way, as well as the fact that that people were choosing who they wanted to marry meant that they wanted to read these stories. So I haven't addressed so much the feminist critique perspective yet, but I think it could be very informative. I've read Seidman, also Paula Hyman, about the gendered aspects. Certainly, in the activist scene, gender seems to be no issue, but the gendered aspects, the gendered burden that they're carrying, the fact that men have a dominant voice in a different way. The women have become more independent financially, but the man still has his fights for his leading place in the household in a different way. This also comes up a lot in the migration, where men go first because that's the right thing to do, and then the man will fetch his family afterwards. But this leads to a situation that there's a whole other side to this, which has been largely ignored, and that's been very interesting. That's been very interesting for me. I didn't really leave enough time for that. The woman, the gendered experience of migration for work. The voice of the woman who stayed behind for years, and the men sometimes married someone else. That was also possible, or they just gradually stopped hearing from them. And this whole other side of the migration, especially to America, for financial reasons.
Mm. Thank you, Sarah. Noemi Duel, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. So thank you for this fascinating talk. I want to go a bit beyond love and romance. And I was wondering whether this criticism of individual husbands translates into criticism of the politics, for example, of the Bund in the writings you're looking at. And the second part of the, or the second question, is not second part of the same question, is about female friendship. I mean, how much did these writers that you're looking at influence each other, kind of reinforcing certain themes and so on? So if you could speak a little bit about this, would be really happy to hear about it.
Yeah. So your first question was about beyond individual husbands. I haven't looked into that so much, but that's interesting. Thank you. Certainly, in the previous era, in the arranged marriages, we have the men of the community deciding for other couples, particularly poor couples, who they should marry, and what makes a good marriage in the interest of the community. Sorry, your second question
was about female friendship and how much they influence.
Yeah, so that it's interesting. In the Avram Reisen writes about a few writers write about the women cutting their hair short in the Bund, presenting themselves in a more masculine way. He compares her to George Sand, George Sand, the French woman writer, wrote about social issues, and but dressed in trousers at that time. It's interesting. I can see that the women are in connection with each other, but they were also very much the editors of the newspapers were still men. They were very much interested in their connections with men, and I see more discussions between men and women rather than woman to woman about encouraging each other on certain themes or to write for certain newspapers. I haven't seen so much of it yet. I know that in historical research that sometimes the criticism women, it's also in their stories. The theme is very much of women not supporting each other, of wealthy women. I know that within the Bund in activism, wealthy women did support other women, but in the stories there's resentment, competition, a lack of support between the poor and the working class women. So I suspect that that this reflected what they saw around them. It may also be what they practiced without realizing.
Okay, Sarah, let me just finally, we've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah,
I'll sort of take them as a group of questions, as it were, and just ask you to respond to them briefly so that we can move on to Charlie and still leave a little bit of time at the end for maybe a a broader conversation. So the first, well, there are two questions. Two questions from Marion Kaplan. First, I assume you are integrating some of Elissa Ben-Porad's and Anita Norwich's work, and
Yes.
she also asks, and also did they, I imagine the novelists, did they hear about prostitution or the traffic in women, ? And then the other question came from Isabel Hedrick. What kind of schooling was available to working class girls and women in Minsk? So that, I suppose the question of literacy, and also, have you been able to compare these writings to those of non-Jewish female writers from Minsk and draw out what aspects of their writing are specific to their Jewishness? So, all yours.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the writings of non-Jewish female writers yet, but thank you for suggesting it. Would broaden and give me a wider perspective about the prostitution or traffic in women. As yet, I haven't seen anything touching on this topic. Well, the closest that I've come to it is Brokhes' story, Golda's complaint, Golda's lament, where a man travels with the neighbor, the female neighbor, to America together, posing as husband and wife, and she has this terrible jealousy. And then there's another story of Brokhes where the man comes back. She has also another story where the man takes another wife, but I haven't found anything about these topics. Even though at the same time that they were writing, this could be seen in the films. The films, absolutely. And the Shund literature touches on this, and these women writers don't. I know in Brokhes' case, she was still traditionally religious. I wouldn't say that it's prudish, but they do shy away from this, even though we know historically that was going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, at this point for your very sort of fulsome and insightful answers. You'll stay with us, I hope.
Absolutely, I'll stay on screen and then I'll switch to the phone. Thank you very much.
In the light of Charlie's paper, but for now, thank you. So Charlie, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I'll share it now.
Okie doke. Right. So I'll just give the floor to you, Charlie. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Neil. Let me guess. On full screen. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yep. Yeah. Cool.
We can.
Brilliant. Thank you for everyone who's come to listen and hear our papers this evening. My paper will initially provide a overview of my thesis as it will currently set out. I'm going to introduce you to some of the families which I researched, and then touch upon a few kind of initial threads which appear in my intro and my first chapter, just as more kind of individual aspects of the wider research. So, as I said, I'll give a brief overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to touch on some kind of auto-ethnographical considerations of my research on positionality as a researcher on my own outsideness. We're going to go into kind of like a spatial analysis of some of the correspondences and look at the spatial retreat of German Jewish life during the 1930s. We're going to look at this notion of epistolary spaces, how the letter acts in a particular way, and then we're going to look at some of the individual correspondences themselves and look at how we can talk about the desire to write silences within the correspondence, and then anti-Jewish persecution and the Holocaust within this. So these are 5 photographs I've taken from the 5 individual families which I research. So I guess I'd briefly talk you through some of them, and then we can go on from there. So the top left, we have a photo of Marianne Goldberg, who later became known as Marianne Ferguson, and her archive is held at Manchester Central Library. She was born in Plauen. Her family were from. She herself wanted to go to Mandate Palestine, but her parents sent her to Britain. Her father managed to escape first to Nice, then through to Portugal. Went out through Portugal and ended up in Cuba. Her mother stayed behind and did not escape. The correspondence between Marion and her mother and Marion and her father is fairly extensive. The correspondence to her father lasts all the way up until the end. Well, it lasts up until 1955, from when they were separated, when he died. But I've examined it up until 1945. In the bottom left, we have a picture of the Amberg family. So you can see the 4 siblings, the 2 on the left, the young boy in the middle, and then the young girl towards the right, with their mother, Anna Amberg, and their grandmother, Bertha Heinemann. The 4 children all managed to escape to Britain during this period and wrote between each other at various points in time. They were able to keep in contact with their mother, Anna, who remained in Aachen, through a intermediary in the USA. In the middle, we have a picture of Clara Licht. This is from the Licht. I should mention that these papers, the Amberg papers, and the ones on the bottom right, which we'll talk about in a bit, are all private collections. The Licht-Königsberger family, 3 generations of the same family managed to escape to Britain in between 1933 and 1939, and wrote to each other between various points in time. Clara herself also kept diaries, which I will use later in this presentation. In the top right, we have one of the 2 archival collections. This shows a young Theodor Hirschberg. His letters between him and various members of his family, mainly his cousin, Dr. Ernst Bohm. They are held at the University of Southampton and were bought by auction in the early 2000s. These have been translated and are written about these separately. And in the bottom right, we have a picture of Anne-Laure Rothschild. This is another private collection consisting of hundreds of letters written between Anne-Laure and her parents, who had remained in Germany, on her efforts to get them out. She did manage to do this, and the correspondence ends in 1939. Indeed, it's the only one that I have that stops at the start of the war, because they were reunited. So that is an overview of the families themselves. In my thesis, I use these 5 letter collections to mediate on what the letter means for these families and how it operates. I look at how the letter is discussed within the letters themselves, what it means to the people, what knowledge of the Holocaust can we gain from these, what emotions we can glean from these written accounts, and how emigration is discussed. So it's kind of manifests itself as a kind of deep source analysis on the Holocaust letter and how it operated during the 1930s in German Jewish families. So as my research took on more, it became quite evident that the issue of positionality and my own relationship to these families was becoming ever more apparent, and felt like something I should touch upon more than just in passing. I think this is very important in regard to the fact that I use a small number of families, 3 of which are private collections, and the other 2 I have been in contact with the families a great deal. So it's not just me doing this research to unknown individuals. Often I've been to the family homes, I've sat down with them, I've discussed it with the families, and that imbues the research with a different sense of importance on my part, even though I'm not related to them, and I sit often in a kind of outsider position. And this has led to various kind of musings on my role as a researcher and the role of the researcher in the Holocaust. Questions of kind of objectivity. Can one be objective with the Holocaust? And also, should one should be objective? It feels almost incongruous to have this kind of remove oneself from the history. It also led me to discuss things around the place of the archive and what Laura Auslander has said about that the Holocaust specifically made the unnoticeable noticeable. She says about how even she says about how people who would not have otherwise left archival trace, a bit of interest to researchers or archivists, are now the subject of deep histories. Hannah Holzschneider takes this further and says that even though the Holocaust is the reason such collections exist in the modern day, we must not put this at the central point of their lives. This is a noble quest, but it's not always possible in many regards, especially if the only parts of the archive that have been saved are the ones from the years of persecution. As much as I've tried to contextualize their lives more broadly than just about their separation and death. Now, for these families who own these collections, it became very clear that they are more than just the details on the page. They're more than just a repository of historical data. They are kind of these embodied mementos, in the language of Carol Kidron. They hold a certain materiality to them, and that's not just for historians, researchers, and families now, but also at the time. There is a certain materiality to the letter and its importance in family discussions. The more you get involved with these sort of private collections, the empathetic part comes out, the noting of how the families deal with these histories and how we can start to talk about this. And I think that's that kind of speaks to this idea that Danny Kranz talks about as that the kind of ethnographic eye can lift hidden discourses, that we gain more perhaps by discussing these archives in a broader sense rather than just as historical data, but as parts of this wider history, as parts of my research journeys, as part of a longer family history. And this also all centers around my own outsiderness. I'm not German, I'm not Jewish, I'm not related. So that comes with numerous practical issues in terms of reading in translation. I've got a photograph there of me and my translator, Christina Baumgartner, who's translated 3 of the collections for me. So we work very closely on what certain words mean, how we can interpret it, how we can deal with this. But also on a more theoretical level, that letters are dialogical. Therefore, anyone reading them is going to have some sort of outsiderness if you're not the intended reader. And that means in terms of shared histories, shared jokes, nicknames, or even just understanding, and the syntax of how it is written will change based on who is reading it. And this kind of leads in kind of any study of this sort, one becomes adjacent to these histories. You have to recognize your own position in it, as in reading and translation, as in not being related to, and recognize one's outsiderness within these histories that are so personal and that are so important to people now. So I want to go on to discuss some things briefly around what we how I'm using these letters and in what sort of context we are using them. And I want to start off by discussing spatial retreat of German Jewish families at the time. There's been a recent work by Guy Maron on space and time in the German Jewish experience, which is worth reading, on this notion of a spatial retreat and of the retreat into the home. Jewish spaces exist both physically and metaphysically, in terms of community, prayer, but also synagogue, cemetery, etc. This is equal to a production of Nazi space, a Volksgemeinschaft that excludes the Jewish community. Confino talks about a space without Jews before a world without Jews, and this is in terms of marches, in terms of banners, signs, flags, all things that don't explicitly exclude Jews, but create a space that is non-welcoming to them. This leads many Jewish families to retreat into the home, and the home in the letter becomes a much more significant place for Jewish families post mid-late 1930s. This is a retreat into the home and a retreat into the family, those close members that will support you. Guy Maron has previously talked about the retreat into paper, and he talked about this in terms of the diary. I would argue that this is also in terms of the letter, and this is a retreat to a new epistolary space, especially when families are separated due to forced migration. On the picture on the right, you can see the Amberg children. Karl Amberg, the young boy on the lap, made it to England, was educated at Winchester College, and was eventually interned and sent to Canada. We have very detailed correspondence of him to his sisters, and also him directly to his mother. For him, this was important because this was the only link he had to his family being isolated on a different continent. And that the Amberg family, as you can see here, held their own home, held a very significant place in their family unit. You can see here a quote from Anna Amberg writing to her late husband's cousin Emil, who is in the USA. She writes in 1939 that who can say what else can happen here. She's talking about the feelings that she has on the assumption that she's going to migrate. She didn't, and this did fall through. She did eventually have to leave the house to go to a Judenhaus. But this quote is from her kind of initial wish to leave her house. But she does this with a certain trepidation and also sense of loss. She writes, "When I sit here as I do at the moment in the open country on the terrace, all green around me, grass and forest and dew, then I can't imagine that soon all this will disappear from my orbit." So she talks about this metaphorical space of the home as a family space that they all used to previously occupy. However, they're no longer together, and therefore that means that letters become this point where they can go to. And for each family, for each letter writer, for each letter itself, there is a specificity of this. Janet Altman writes that to write a letter is to map one's coordinates, temporal, spatial, emotional, intellectual. She notes that it is particular to the shared world of the writer and the addressee. Now, this has practical implications in terms of, as I've said, specific language, specific names, shared memories, but also in the feel and in the way in which it is written. They are particular to the people. That means each letter itself is written in a particular context, in a different kind of place and special context. James Howe has written on the letter in the 17th century in terms of postal workers, and he writes that epistolary spaces between letter writers and readers are then specific to each individual correspondence, and they are imagined in many different ways. So there's something specific to each individual letter and individual family, and therefore it deserves to be analysed as such. This forced separation of many families led to a need, a desire to write. You can see the top quote from Clara Licht from her diary. I say her diary, you can see it in the background. It's an envelope which is specifically attuned to her thoughts and feelings on her son Ernst and his wife Ilse, who had stayed in Berlin. They were the only members of the family that had Clara's daughter Alice and her family, and also Ernst and Ilse's son Klaus had all come over to Britain. Clara still tries to write to her son even after the start of the war in September 1939. She writes that it is useless and that she's writing this to a void, and yet she still does it. She still writes. She still sends it into the void, knowing that it might not reach them, but it's worth a try. Later into the war, in 1943, from one of the other families that I researched, we see a similar thing, that the letter takes on a different sort of importance when one cannot be with your family. Walter Goldberg is Marion Goldberg's father. He's in Cuba. She's in London at this point in time. He reminds her of a newspaper article, Aus Kindern werden Briefe, where children turn into letters, and he says he hopes that letters will turn back in to the children. And much of the correspondence is full of this notion of the desire to write, the desire to read letters, the desire to reread letters. This process of reading and rereading is also important. There's also an element of silence within these correspondences that's imposed and self-imposed due to the censor and to the fear of the censor, but also a more kind of close-knit, intimate notion of not wanting to harm, not wanting to scare, not wanting to incite fear into family members. So there's lack of kind of honesty over the situation. Marion Ferguson, in her archive boxes, there are 3 cassette tapes of completely unknown authenticity. I've tried to date them to work out who's interviewing, but there's nothing. What she does say about the letters to her mother and also to her father, that she says, I didn't write about everything that happened. I only wrote some things because I found it very difficult at the time. So she's saying the actual process of writing, whilst important to maintain contact, is a difficult one for her. Theodore Hirschberg, that's actually around the wrong way. It's actually Ernst Baum to Theodore Hirschberg, not Theodore Hirschberg to Ernst Baum. Anyway, they are cousins. Ernst is in Antwerp, Theodore's in London. Ernst writes that you never write a lot about yourself, not even about your current occupation. This is your usual inferiority complex, which we haven't been able to fight successfully. This is a gripe that I had much also with Theodore, because it's very difficult to learn anything about him from his own correspondences, because he doesn't write anything about himself. And to do this, we have to activate the institutional archive. We have to go through records and other sources where the letter is not enough to contextualize itself. Yelena Losobutek says, what can one piece of paper tell us without the story behind it? And there is a sense of a need to contextualize in some way. Historical actors themselves contribute to these silences, as I've said, by not writing things, by writing in certain ways to certain people. The specificity of the epistolary space makes it so that silences are often imbued within this. In the last two parts, I've got about 2 minutes left, I will talk about some of the notions towards the end of my thesis about how violence is talked about, how anti-Jewish persecution is talked about, and what place this serves in the correspondence. This is just one example of a discussion of the November pogroms in 1938. Siegfried Rothschild is on the right here. He's writing to his daughter Anne-Laure in London. He says that the house in which your brother about 2 months ago with you, Much, me, and all our friends were, has been flattened. Again, linking back to this notion of a time when they were all together, the retreat to the home. He says about the efforts to keep heads high up, but then says, I do not wish to comment any further. And there's no further mention of Kristallnacht or further violence in this way. Siegfried was a very authoritative figure and was very much the dominant male in the household. You can see in this quote also his thoughts on Herschel Grinspan in the certain ways he writes about him. But we can see the way in which anti-Jewish persecution is discussed here in a very limited sense, as not to fear his daughter anymore. As a last kind of point, I'm going to cite two letters from 1940 and 1941, one from the Goldberg collection, one from the Amberg collection. Rosa is the mother, and she's writing to her sister and also her daughter, because they were forwarded knowingly. She says that the events here are not as bright as they might look from your perspective. This is her way of saying their lives are getting much more difficult. Food at this point would have been difficult for them, partly because she is caring for her parents also. That's the reason why she stayed behind. And then in the Amberg collection, Anna says about dark clouds appearing on the horizon. And these are all sorts of ways of discussing and referring to the Holocaust and persecution before it had that name, before the wider concept of what was going on was occurring. You knew that dark clouds were appearing and things were not as bright, perhaps, as they seem. Those get some few quotes from the end parts of my thesis, but I will finish there in the interests of time and of talking about it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Charlie, again for a wonderful overview of your project, and again a little bit of an insight into the sort of the detail and the texture there as well. Let me just as before throw the floor open and ask if anybody has any questions for Charlie. Either into the chat or I guess, Charlie, the sort of obvious point to start, and it's already a sort of implicit sort of reference to Sarah's paper too, is we're a very, very long way away from the kind of working class communities of Minsk in the social spheres that you're describing. I mean, it's an incredibly kind of well-heeled group of case studies. One of your examples goes to Winchester College, which says something. And the other ones, the sort of Rothschilds, the name kind of needs not much adumbration, right? So, is there something sort of specifically bourgeois about this culture of letter writing, or does that just happen to be the 5 collections that you've found, or is there something bourgeois about the practice of archiving them rather than tossing them away? I don't know. Does it matter at all?
I think you're right in the sense of that. Just to look over some of the kind of jobs of the founders, I suppose the Licht family were all lawyers. The Ambergs were engineers. The Rothschilds, they were business people. The Goldbergs, they were booksellers. They were not very well off at all at this point. But I think you're right in terms of especially pre this period. It's definitely I would say it's a bourgeois practice, but it's a wider process in this time period anyway. But I think there is something to be said about separation prompting letter writing anyway. Like the vast majority of our sources on migration are through letters. That's how people have to communicate. If you want to communicate, that's how you're going to do it. And that means that you write on the thinnest paper imaginable. So lots of these ones are on very, very thin paper. They're written on double sides. They're crammed full of everything. Like they're not wasting anything. Also, I think so. I think it probably was a bourgeois practice, but I don't necessarily see it as that in terms of this time period. That being said, obviously, the vast majority of German Jewish refugees that came over were of that the social class. It was easier to emigrate. You're more likely to have connections abroad. Therefore, it was easier. So it's one of these things that the class of the people that were immigrating were more bourgeois, but that I don't think that necessarily correlates to letter writing for all of these people being a practice like that. Because the vast majority of, say, sources on kind of ordinary people, David Gerber talks about this in his book on letter writing amongst American migrants. He says that the letter is by far the largest source on ordinary people that we have through the lens of migration. So a bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that's a kind of a segue into Marion Kaplan's question in the chat, which you sort of half answered, but you can probably expand upon. I wonder if Charlie is using other books about letter writing by refugees or non-Jewish immigrants.
Yes, so I think in terms of the kind of theoretical approach, yes, because there's very little on. As Marion knows, there's not much on letter writing during the Holocaust as a thing anyway. Marion's one of the only people to have written about it in detail. So in terms of a theoretical approach, yes, there are growing research on letter writing in the Holocaust, which is great. So I'm tying into that quite a bit. But yeah, books mainly by David Gurr, by Liz Stanley, by other people writing about the letter. I recently started to tie into works on diary writing to see the crossover between these types of legal documents and see how we can learn perhaps from these and see how they cross over in terms of the genre and of the way in which they are they are written. So yes, letter writing by refugees, letter writing in general, non Jewish immigrants at the time, not so much, just because I've not been aware of as many. But if you have any suggestions, Marion, I'd be very grateful to hear from them. So yeah.
I suppose the book that many of us know, not least because she's a former colleague, is Shirley Gilbert's.
Yep.
Can you say anything about how you position your work and your reading of
I think
relationship to her?
I think lots of the existing scholarship on letter writing uses very large letter collections to construct a family narrative, to construct a narrative about migration. I'm thinking of Shirley's work, Joachim's work, kind of escaping Nazi Germany, From Things Lost. I've got a whole shelf up here of like these individual family narratives that are written. My one uses 5 and kind of interrelates them as a whole, and I've done it. I'm hopefully doing it in a way that allows us to deep dive into these family narratives, but not just through one. And I know that sounds a kind of a cop-out answer for it. I think it's interesting to perhaps not to compare them, but to see how different localities, different families differ in the way that they've written their letters. I think there is merit to focusing on one family and doing a deep dive into that. The fact is, I didn't have a collection, as Shirley did, of 4,000 letters that would take me 10 years to go through. So on a very practical level, I'm working with collections that are 300, say, letters maximum. That's probably the largest or so. And that allows me to look through these different ways in which individual families have kind of piqued their correspondence, as opposed to a deep dive into one, to see how it changes over time, which has its place. But I think that's been done by a number of scholars.
Yeah. Okay. So you're sort of, I suppose, foregrounding more the genre of the letter and the practice of writing, and asking, well, what does that help us to think about in terms of the sort of subjectivities of the actors concerned and their emotions and relations to one another, rather than sort of reconstruct I suppose a journey and a set of, I suppose, changing interactions between two people, for which the letter just becomes a sort of a source of body mind, as it were.
And I think also you see how relationships are fractured, how they're put under pressure, and also how they're often built and how they're morphed by changes. And also, like I've given talks previously on kind of parenting through the letter, because obviously a lot of these people, especially in the case of the Goldberg family, Marion's father didn't see her again, so their correspondence lasts for about, I don't know how long, it must be about 16 or 17 years worth of correspondence, and he doesn't see her again, so he parents her through the letters. And it's really interesting to see how their relationship exists in this world in this new space in which they can't sit around a dinner table and discuss things. It's like they talk very, very openly, I think, for a father and daughter through their letters, because they have to, because there's no option. So it changes the meaning of the letter from merely a source of information to an active part in this person's lives.
So Marion's just put another reference in the chat, which you can probably just look in your own time, a sort of helpful suggestion for a text. Anushka sort of has offered a kind of a very open question, which is just about the ways in which your research has confounded your own assumptions going into it. Whether that's the case, what do you think now that you didn't think before, or what have you abandoned thinking that you initially as you've gone through the work?
Well, I think originally I had this idea of only looking at refugees that came to Britain and wrote back to Germany in kind of this one-way chain. Obviously, it doesn't work like that, right? The Amberg family is spread over numerous continents because they migrate, they're interned, they go on multiple migrations elsewhere, and those local dynamics play a part in terms of the Theodor Hirschberg archive. I had it translated without knowing what was in it. As I've done with all of them. So it's been a case of I didn't know what I expected because I didn't know what I was going to do at the start. So the 5 collections have been used because those are the 5 collections that are there. And I would write a very different PhD if I had another 5 collections. And I don't think that's a bad way of doing it at all, because I didn't go in knowing what I wanted to know, because the letters told me that. The letters told me what the concept of space is interesting here because they discuss their home loads. They discuss it as a physical entity, and then, okay, let's talk about this as a kind of metaphysical one too. So you go from there with it. So I think that's changed also. The place of the archive has done a lot for me, I think, partly because I chose to work with private collections, and that means going to meet the families, going to have dinner with them, talking through them, translating them with people. So it's much more of a process, a kind of autoethnographical approach to the research, because I think that was merited by the fact that these families are still alive. They're still in their private collections. They are very much part of an ongoing family narrative, an ongoing family research. That seems silly to kind of stop these correspondences and these family stories at 1945, because they don't. Right, these letter collections are being found now. They're being pulled out of lofts now, and that is part of this ongoing narrative of these letters, this ongoing life of these letters. So that's something that I didn't necessarily intend on getting so involved with it, but it has. So, and I think that's an important part of my research, because it ties the importance of these collections to the families and to me as a researcher, and the families then and now. Okay. So yeah, I started off with lots of different things, and then it doesn't work out like that.
No, well, good, but that's why it's called research. I mean, that's fine. Noemi, you've got a hand up again.
Yes. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I had 2 questions. One was about other themes that you haven't really talked about in the presentation. I mean, a big part of immigrants' experience, whether you're a refugee or not, is complaining about the country you find yourself in. And I was wondering whether this was present in the letters you look at in as catharsis in a way, and sharing, your bewilderment with fellow immigrants, or does this fall into the category of silence that you mentioned, like this is not the time to complain? And the second question was about the type of objects you look at in your research. I mean, you mentioned letters. I was wondering whether you have other types of objects that are important in correspondence at the time, which are postcards. And if you have postcards, how you look at their visual aspect, their visual message.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. I'll do the first one because it's more about the content of the letter, I suppose, about the kind of lamenting your situation, moaning about the place in some regard. I think that is very different based on the situation of the refugee that I've encountered. For example, in the case of Marion Goldberg, she is a young girl. She's alone in this country. She finds solace amongst a house of other young girls around that same age, and through the kind of youth groups that she's a part of. She resented coming to Britain, very much so. She wanted to go to Palestine, and they didn't send her there. So for her, she hated being here. She talked about it very openly, so much so that her father warns her that you shouldn't moan so much because the censors might not like that. So she kind of curbs her herbs her feelings on that, to stop, and kind of stops writing about that once her father says to her that perhaps that might not be the best idea. So I think that's one. Also, in terms of the other ones, not so much. I think they discuss their situation and discuss their place, but a lot of the correspondence is often rather dull, and I think that's kind of says more about it too, in the sense that a lot of it is talking about your daily life, about what you got up for breakfast in the morning, about, and a lot of it is not. I think actually that's something that I thought about when I first started reading it. Is I thought there'd be more, I don't know, more immediately obvious stuff linking it to the experience of German Jewish families more widely, and the Holocaust more widely. But actually it's not. A lot of it is just talking about your everyday life, and that's, the more I think about it, the more it's to kind of to be expected to kind of maintain this continuity. To a certain extent, then these migrant letters talk about the situation, but they also don't want to convey a ungratefulness to the families that have sent them to these places, and want to maintain this kind of aura of everything being okay, even when it's not. So yeah, there's that aspect to it. In terms of the other kind of aspect, the other material elements of these collections, I've focused on letters and postcards, I should say. There are a few diaries in the collections, which I do discuss, but not in depth, because it's not the focus of my thing. I use them as contextual evidence, and I've given papers, and I have an article that I'm writing at the moment on the diaries aspect of it, because I couldn't find a place for them necessarily in my thesis in the detail that I wanted to write something else on them. So the diaries are there. In terms of the postcards, they're postcards, but they're not like photo, like we would think, like they're not like holiday ones where you have a photo of that. They're crammed full of them, like a letter, and often you can see they're from a set, so you have a set and then use them from there. So I've not really thought about what the difference is for a postcard and for a letter in terms of the way perhaps we conceptualize it, or how it would have been received. I've not really thought that much about that. So that might be something worth going into. About, is there a difference between these type of scrawled on bits of paper versus on a postcard? I don't know, and I've not, and I think that's probably something that is worth noting, at least. Is there a difference in the way that they're written or conceived of when they're received? I don't know, but it's a good point. So I'm going to do some reading on that and find out what I think. My gut feeling is probably not as much as I would initially ascribe to it, but just because they mix in between different points, and they serve the same purpose often, just with less space. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. You're muted, Neil. Sorry.
So, well, I mean, one point that's so banal that it's hardly worth making is that, you know, in the context in which you're describing, writing on a postcard which isn't in an envelope changes the legibility of it for, you know, other people's eyes. But I think if I was trying to think about that question, the one thing I would remember is that we have a sort of assumption that postcards are used in essentially kind of touristic, you know, modes of writing these days, with a picture of a, you know, wherever you visited or wherever your holiday is. But back then, postcards are sort of bits of printed stationery that people use in everyday life in a much broader sense, much more so than we do now. So I would hazard a guess, actually, that even most postcards don't have a picture on them. They're just blank.
I think also, I mean, like,
with a printed, pre-printed stamp on them.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking of it, because especially in terms of the most postcards I have it in the Hirschberg collection, which are at like Southampton, and they're one aspect of this multi-correspondence going everywhere, and it appears they're all get out of the same book. So I presume they've guessed. I don't know if you could buy a pack of postcards like that would just be used as kind of like letter text and then send them on from there. So
you could buy like 100 postcards just for use as everyday stationery, and they already have a little printed stamp on them. They're like prepaid, basically. So it's a long way away from sending a postcard from your week in Cornwall or something. It's a different kind of slightly different function there. But that's just banal observations. Does anyone have any other quick questions, or would anyone like to sort of hazard any comments that maybe bring the two papers into conversation a little bit? I've sort of, as I've listened to you both, I've oscillated between thinking, wow, these two really speak to each other, but oh gosh, no, these really take us in very different directions. And I guess the point of obvious intersection for me was Charlie, when you offered us that sort of very snobby quote from Siegfried Rothschild about the plebs from Galicia. And of course, by extension, it's not quite the right space, but by extension, he's basically talking about Sarah's subjects, right? And he's looking down his nose at a culture that Sarah's shown us is kind of wonderfully creative, diverse, interesting, thoughtful, all of those things. And it's just one kind of thing that shows us that sort of Jewish life and experience, but Jewish mentalities and mindsets and subjectivities are just so incredibly kind of different at different points in time, and depending on who you are, that one does, to go back to a previous question, wonder whether the Jewishness of these authors are enough to sort of link the papers, or whether in fact we're dealing with quite different problems that just happen to be linked by.
I think also, I think you're right in terms of like the experiences of the families that I researched. They are very much caught up in their own lives and their own worlds and their own sense of belonging to a German culture. All of them are very culturally German, and their Jewishness doesn't appear as much really at all in many of the correspondences. Partly because they didn't identify themselves in that way, but as you can see, the quote from Siegfried Rothschild, I could have picked one of 100 letters where he talks not necessarily about that specifically, but just in a very terse manner and very abrupt, and he is amusing and infuriating to read in equal measure. I'd say something to me which struck out, which is the literariness and how you read a letter. Can one ascribe literary analysis principles and literary scholar discussions to a study of eager documents, to a study of letters like this. I suppose the literary angle is something that I haven't explicitly touched upon, but I think it is important to note that these type of sources can be read in the same way, or in similar ways, I should say, to constructed novels Sarah was talking about, because I think in many ways they share some element of that construction. That's just another thing throughout there.
So, Sarah, did you want to have the last word? I can see that you're in a car, so I don't know how kind of easy it will be to hear your voice. Or
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear that. Yeah.
I'm in a car and I'm very far away, but yes. So it was interesting for me. I did see commonalities. It's interesting. The neglected sources of writing, German letters that were sometimes handwritten in German. What Charlie said now about looking at them in a literary way. And on my side, stories that were serialized in the newspaper, maybe dismissed as part of the pulp literature, and then taking a second look. It was interesting what you said about the Jewishness and the world. It seemed to me that the correspondence that when Charlie was talking about children and parents who've been separated, sometimes for more than a decade, it was a time of crisis, and their world was small. In the writings that I looked at, yes, it was a time of crisis with people getting on a boat to America, but it was also from the women's point of view, it was a time of growth. It was a time when they had a greater voice, also as working class women, as working class people, as women, as Jews, as the Jewish press, the Yiddish press, giving a bigger voice and a communication to a bigger group. Their voice and the people they could reach, their readership was growing, and the world of the families that Charlie was speaking about was shrinking. It's interesting. He said also about the Jewishness and about not being conscious of it. Or I think that also in the writings that I've looked at, when we look from the outside, many of the circumstances that they were in, that was because they were Jewish, because of the laws that applied to Jews at that time, because of the restrictions, because of the community traditions, but they don't reflect on that consciously. But when we're researching it, we can see that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Well, we've had a very sort of full evening with, very rich papers and, quite extensive discussion. So I just want to end by thanking you both. Very, very enjoyable indeed, very insightful. I hope that the sort of questions and comments gave you a few things to chew upon as you sort of bring the thinking
Absolutely
conclusion. And especially Sarah, I'm grateful to you for sort of overcoming the technical sort of challenges and the logistical issues involved in the.
Thank you for accommodating me.
On the run. Not at all. Okie doke. So
thank you very much.
I wish everybody a good evening.